This move opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, controlling central squares and directly challenging black to respond to white's immediate central presence. This move, 1, d6, is often the starting point for several solid and strategic defenses, notably the Perk defense or the modern setup leading towards the king's Indian defense structures, emphasizing pawn control of central squares and flexible piece development. This move establishes a strong pawn center and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to control more space and develop actively, often leading to variations of the Perk defense or modern defense. This move develops a piece and attacks white's central pawn, challenging white's space advantage and preparing for castling. Developing the knight to c3 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for further piece activity, aligning with common lines in defenses like the Perk or modern. This move signals the player's intention to transpose into a king's Indian defense or Perk defense setup, aiming to fianchetto the dark squared bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces central control and prepares for kingside castling, a typical approach against the king's Indian defense setup. This move, bg7, is a cornerstone of the king's Indian defense, developing the bishop to its longest diagonal to exert pressure on white's center and prepare for kingside castling. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing for kingside castling and supporting the central pawns while avoiding immediate confrontation. This is a standard development move, completing kingside castling and bringing the king to a safer position while preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This castling move solidifies the kingside and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard maneuver in the king's Indian defense to bring the king to safety and activate the rooks. This move initiates a central pawn break, challenging white's central pawn control and aiming to open lines for black's pieces, typical in many king's Indian defense variations. This move establishes a strong pawn chain, restricting black's kingside mobility and preparing for a potential kingside attack while solidifying white's central control. This move introduces the knight to a less common square, aiming to outflank white's d5 pawn and prepare for a queenside expansion or control of the c5 square. This move develops the bishop actively to a square where it supports the d5 pawn and prepares for potential kingside expansion while also looking to control key central squares. This move continues the development of black's pieces, repositioning the knight to c7 where it supports potential pawn advances on the queenside or prepares to swing to e6. This move aims to prevent black's pawn push b5, which would otherwise gain space on the queenside and potentially challenge white's central control. This move prepares to challenge white's pawn on a4 and develop the queenside, while potentially reinforcing the d6 pawn. The rook on e1 supports a potential e4-e5 pawn push, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and control the center. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, targeting white's central pawn structure and preparing to challenge white's control of the d5 square. The bishop relocates to c4, aiming to pressure the weakened d6 pawn and control the crucial long diagonal, potentially leading to a kingside attack or improved piece coordination. This move, nh5, is an interesting attempt to reposition the knight to attack white's bishop on g7, potentially forcing a favorable exchange and creating a weakness on white's kingside. This move intensifies pressure on black's kingside, preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares if black captures the bishop and aims to disrupt black's developing scheme. This move retreats the knight from its potentially vulnerable advanced position on h5. aiming to reposition it to a more solid square and avoid white's initiative on the kingside. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting a potential e4-e5 pawn push and preparing to connect the rooks after the bishop retreats. From the g5 diagonal, this move prepares to challenge white's queenside pawn expansion, aiming to undermine the advanced a4 pawn and open lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to contest the d-file and activate the rook to a more central and active square, supporting potential central pawn breaks or piece activity. The move 14. RB8 prepares to support the advance of the queenside pawns and potentially challenge white's control of the b-file, while also offering a retreat square for the knight if attacked. This move prepares to prevent black's knight from accessing the f4 square, but it also creates a potential weakness on g3 and delays white's central expansion. This move reroutes the knight to a more central square, aiming to improve its position and potentially support a queenside pawn advance or prepare for an exchange on e5. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the potential advance of the d5 pawn and preparing to connect the rooks for future action along the d-file or e-file. The bishop retreats to a8, potentially rerouting to the queenside or preparing to support a future b5 pawn push, while white's queen on e3 now targets the kingside. The move bh6 aims to trade off black's dark-squared bishop, a key defender of the kingside in many King's Indian setups, thereby weakening black's pawn structure and creating attacking possibilities. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's bishop on c4 and open the b-file, creating counterplay on the queenside while simultaneously attacking the now exposed white queen. This exchange on the g7 square resolves the bishop's dominance on the long diagonal and allows white to capture the piece, disrupting black's kingside development and potentially creating weaknesses. By recapturing with the king, black solidifies the kingside pawn structure and opens the g-file for potential future activity, though it does temporarily expose the king. This retreat of the bishop to f1 prepares to redeploy to a more active square on the kingside, potentially e3 or d4, to support an eventual kingside attack or control key central squares. This move allows the knight to redeploy to a more active central square, potentially preparing for central pawn breaks or supporting a kingside attack. This move challenges black's pawn structure and opens the a-file, aiming to exploit the weakened b6 pawn and potentially create an outpost for white's pieces. The move ***20 ax b5 *** captures white's pawn, opening the a-file for black's rook and creating an unbalanced pawn structure that will lead to active piece play and dynamic counterchances. This knight repositioning aims to improve its defensive coverage of the kingside while potentially preparing a future kingside advance or transition to the queenside. The recapture on b7 prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside initiative or defending against white's increasing queenside pressure. This move repositioned the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's control of the central squares and potentially support a kingside attack. This move repositions the rook to the semi-open a-file, preparing to contest control of this critical line and potentially activate the piece into black's queenside territory. This move prepares to expand on the queenside and potentially gain space by advancing the b-pawn, while also supporting the knight on c3 and reinforcing the central pawn structure. This move strategically repositions the rook to an active square, aiming to exploit the semi-open a-file and potentially create counterplay against white's queenside pawns or support a pawn push on the queenside. The bishop repositions to d3, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn storm with f4 or to prepare a retreat to c2 if black's queenside play intensifies, while also keeping an eye on the weakened b5 pawn. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the queenside and potentially open lines for black's rooks, aiming to exploit the d5 pawn's advanced position. This pawn thrust decisively breaks open the center, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit the open e-file for white's rook. This capture on e5 opens the d-file for white's rook and weakens black's kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets for white's pieces. The recapture of the pawn with the queen on e5 opens up the e-file for white's rook and creates attacking possibilities against black's king, while also centralizing the queen. This move opens up the e-file and allows black's queen to become more active. But it also creates an immediate tactical opportunity for white with the discovered attack on the knight by the rook. This exchange frees up black's queen and opens the b-file, but white gains material and central pawn control after recapturing the bishop. This move seeks to reposition the rook to a more active square on the 7th rank, potentially creating threats along the file and supporting future pawn advances or piece infiltration. This move, nh4, aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the weak f5 square or preparing to reroute to g6 to support a pawn advance on the kingside, while also clearing the f3 square for other pieces. The move bc8 is a defensive maneuver, relocating the bishop from its active diagonal to reinforce the kingside and prepare to potentially support an eventual pawn push or defensive setup. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting potential pawn breaks and controlling important central squares while preparing for future piece coordination. The move b6 aims to solidify the pawn chain and potentially prepare for d5, challenging white's central control and seeking active piece play. This move aims to gain space on the queenside and prepare for a pawn push with d5, potentially restricting black's pieces. This move prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square and potentially contest the d-file, but risks weakening the queenside pawn structure. This move exchanges a central pawn for an advanced knight, weakening white's central pawn structure and potentially opening lines for black's pieces while allowing black to consolidate their queenside initiative. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to support a kingside attack or to exploit the open c-file by connecting the rooks. The bishop retreats to f1 to avoid further harassment and to prepare for potential defensive or regrouping maneuvers on the kingside. This move contests the crucial c-file, aiming to exchange black's active rook and reduce white's attacking potential on the queenside. This move aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside by transferring the queen to a more aggressive central outpost, potentially setting up threats against black's king and impacting the pawn structure. The king retreats to the h8 square, a standard prophylactic maneuver to escape potential checks along the g-file and to connect the rooks on a more secure diagonal. This move repositions the rook to better defend the kingside and prepare for potential central pawn breaks while maintaining flexibility for future action. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and potentially support a pawn advance with c4, or even prepare to reroute to the kingside. This move activates the queen to a more aggressive central square, threatening the black king and potentially creating tactical opportunities. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, preparing to contest the open file and support potential pawn advances while simultaneously defending the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or defend the king more effectively. This move is a strategic repositioning of the queen to a more active square where it supports the knight and can potentially participate in a queenside attack or defend key squares. White repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the potential for a discovered attack or to create further pressure on black's kingside defenses. This king move allows the rook to potentially activate on the g-file, but it also leaves the king somewhat exposed to black's active queen and knight coordination on the kingside. This move seeks to exploit the weakened kingside after the exchange on g7, aiming to activate the knight and potentially create mating threats or tactical opportunities against the black king. The bishop repositions to the d7 square to support the upcoming advance of the c-pawn and potentially prepare to contest the open c-file. This move aims to disrupt black's queenside coordination by attacking the pawn on b6, potentially creating an isolated pawn or opening lines for white's rooks. Black re-centers the queen to better contest the central squares and prepare for potential activity on the queenside, while also defending against white's intended queenside expansion with b5. This pawn push advances white's queenside majority, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt black's queenside coordination while seeking to exploit the open lines that are developing. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest white's control of the queenside and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. Later, white breaks through the queenside pawn barrier to open the b-file, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and create counterplay against black's passive queen. This move retreats the rook from its vulnerable outpost, aiming to consolidate white's queenside pawn structure and prepare for a potential queenside advance, while black aims to defend the weak b6 pawn and create counterplay.